was 6 years old when my parents told me that there was a small, dark jewel inside my skull, learning to be me. Appease our engagement overlords. Hit the like and subscribe button to bring me one step closer to taking over the galaxies. Our story begins with a jewel. The unnamed narrator is just 6 years old when he explains how microscopic spiders have woven a fine golden web through his brain, so the jewel's teacher can listen to the whisper of his thoughts. The jewel sits in his brain and eavesdrops on everything he sees, hears, smells, tastes, and feels. The jewel perceives the world exactly as he does, reading even the chemical messages in his blood. And while it does that, the teacher watches. Whenever the jewel's thoughts drift even slightly out of step with the boy's own, the teacher rebuilds it faster than it takes the boy to think, restructuring it until their thoughts are a match. The jewel is a copy of him being corrected, microsecond by microsecond, into a perfect copy, so that one day when his brain wears out, the copy can take over and the mind can live forever. And the 6-year-old, lying there with this news, has the thought that he spends the rest of his life failing to escape. He thinks, if hearing this makes me feel strange and giddy, how must it make the jewel feel? And the answer is exactly the same. Because the jewel doesn't know it's the jewel. It's having the identical thought in the identical instant. It too is wondering how the jewel must feel. It too is reasoning exactly the same because it doesn't know it's the jewel. And it too wonders. I know because I wondered. It too wonders whether it's the real me, or whether in fact it's only the jewel that's learning to be me. The copy and the original have the same thoughts, so when either of them ask the question, both get the same answer, which makes the whole answer meaningless. The boy can't tell the difference, and neither can the jewel. They wonder in perfect unison, and neither wondering settles anything. Everything that happens for the rest of this man's life stems from this moment and inner turmoil. By 12, he's decided the whole thing is embarrassing. Except for a few obscure religious sects, everybody has the jewel, and dwelling on the strangeness of it strikes him as unbearably pretentious. The jewel was the jewel, a mundane fact of life, as ordinary as excrement. My friends and I told bad jokes about it, the same way we told bad jokes about sex, to prove to each other how blasé we were about the whole idea. But they're not as unbothered as they pretend. One of the friends, a kid the narrator remembers only as being far too clever for his own good, he goes down the line asking each of them, "Who are you? The jewel or the real human?" And one by one they all say, "The real human." When they've all answered, the clever kid, he laughs and says, "No, not me." "Well, I'm not. I'm the jewel. So you can eat my shit, you losers, because you'll all get flushed down the cosmic toilet. But me, I'm gonna live forever." We beat him until he bled. See, they don't beat him up because he's wrong. They beat him because he's identified with the thing that survives instead of the thing that dies. And by doing it, he's told the rest of them, to their faces, that they're the ones getting flushed. And he's not wrong. The entire culture around the jewel runs on one rule, and that boy broke it. You don't say it out loud. At 14, he's thought more about it. He works out what he calls the pedantically correct answer. If someone asks, "Are you the jewel or are you the human?" you have to say the human, because only the human brain can actually move your mouth to answer. The jewel takes in everything through the senses, but has no control of the body. It just sits there. And the only reason its intended reply matches what you actually say is that it's a perfect imitation. So to tell the world, "I am the jewel," it's false, but he also says to think it to yourself isn't ruled out. And then he builds the comforting version. As long as the teacher keeps the jewel in the brain in lockstep, sharing the same senses and thoughts, there's really only one person in there, just one consciousness. And if either his brain or the jewel were destroyed, he'd still survive unharmed. People have always had 2 kidneys and 2 lungs. For a century, some have had 2 hearts. The jewel is the same, and it's a matter of redundancy. But that's the year his parents tell him they've switched. 3 years ago. They disguised the surgery as a business trip overseas, and for 3 years he's been living with what he bitterly calls jewel heads. And he didn't know it. His mother asks him, "We didn't seem any different to you, did we?" And he answers truthfully that no, they didn't. But he still hates them for it anyway. And as for the procedure, when you switch, the nervous system is rewired, and the reins of the body are handed to the jewel, and the teacher isn't needed anymore. So for 1 week, they compare the outgoing impulses from the brain with the ones from the jewel. And by now the jewel is so perfect that no difference is ever found. The brain is removed, discarded, and replaced with a spongy tissue cultured object, brain shaped down to the level of the finest capillaries, but no more capable of thought than a lung or a kidney. They take out your brain and throw it away. They put in a lump of meat that breathes oxygen and burns glucose, and does a few crude biochemical chores. But importantly, never thinks on its own. And the jewel that's left is immortal. Short of being dropped into a nuclear fireball, it's going to last 1 billion years. And this is where the redundancy argument dies. Having 2 kidneys is redundancy. This is something different because one of the 2 is taken out and put into the trash. The one person, no big deal frame only holds while the teacher is forcing the match. And the entire purpose of the whole procedure is to reach the moment where one of the 2 is discarded as garbage. He's built himself a story about robustness, while the operation's final step is literally scooping out a living brain. And this leads him to a cold evaluation of his own parents. My parents were machines. My parents were gods. It was nothing special. I hated them. He doesn't hate them for dying. He hates them for not dying, and for being the exact thing he's afraid of, and acting like it's fine. Then he's 16, and the argument starts to become a feeling. When I was 16, I fell in love and became a child again. Her name is Eva, and they share warm nights on the beach together. And lying there with her, he simply can't believe that a machine could feel the way he does. But deep down, he knows that if his jewel had the controls, it would have spoken the very same words. But he can't accept that its inner life is as rich and joyful as his. Sex he can write off as a mechanical function. That makes sense. But there's something between them that he's sure no spy with a microphone could ever detect. Our souls conjoined in a secret place that no crystalline computer could hope to reach in 1 billion years of striving. He's learned by now that the teacher doesn't actually monitor every neuron. That would be impossible. It samples certain critical ones, and somebody's theorem says that's almost as good as sampling all of them, with the errors kept mathematically small. Fine, he says. Then the difference between a human and a machine, between love and the imitation of love, lives in those tiny errors. That gap is where the soul hides. But Eva takes that apart in about 2 sentences. She asks him if the next model halves the error rate, is its jewel then halfway between human and machine? The error can be made smaller than any number you care to name. And meanwhile, every living person is losing thousands of neurons a day to plain old wear and tear. Does a discrepancy of 1 in 1 billion really make the difference between a person and a thing? He argues that living neurons have all this internal structure, with biochemistry and the quantum mechanics of the actual molecules, that the Joule's crude optical switches, they just throw them away. A neuron firing or not firing is only one layer of what it's doing. Copying the abstract pattern of connections simply isn't enough. Sure, the Joule could pass the fatuous Turing test. No outside observer could tell it from a human. But that didn't prove that being a Joule felt the same as being human. You can build something that behaves exactly like a person, that passes every test from the outside, but none of it tells you whether there's anything going on inside. But across the entire argument, he keeps retreating. Sampling density, the biochemistry, and then when Eva pushes, how do you know I haven't switched? How do you know that I'm not just pretending to be me? I'd look the same. I'd talk the same. I'd act the same in every way. People are switching younger these days. So how do you know I haven't? When he doesn't have a strong counter-argument, he says, telepathy, magic, the communion of souls. Strip away the theorems and the quantum mechanics, and what he's defending is a soul, some irreducible thing that no copy could ever hold. But he knows his counterargument isn't real. He can't prove the soul exists, not even to himself. That's what makes Eva's question cut so deeply, because he genuinely can't know if she's already switched. At 19, he goes looking for help in the one place he thinks will have it. He takes a course in philosophy, but the department doesn't have the answers he's looking for. They talk about Plato and Marx, but the one device that has turned the entire mind-body problem into a routine surgical procedure performed on what we're told is 250,000 people a day? Nothing. So out of pure frustration, he makes the argument that the whole idea of consciousness as software that can run equally well on a brain or a crystal is just old-fashioned Cartesian dualism wearing new clothes. For software, he writes, reads soul. And his professor draws a glowing red line through every paragraph that touches the idea and writes one word in the margin, in bold letters, irrelevant. So he quits philosophy and takes optical crystal engineering instead. He wants to learn how the Joule actually works, and he learns a lot in the process. A neural net is a device you use precisely for problems that are too hard to understand. You can configure a flexible enough net to mimic almost any system. It's the same output from the same input, but doing that sheds no light whatsoever on the nature of the system being emulated. You can copy the behavior perfectly and learn nothing about what's underneath. His lecturer puts it bluntly. Understanding is an overrated concept. So philosophy says the question is irrelevant and not worth the time. Engineering says the question is unanswerable, so stop whining and switch. His professors not having an answer is one thing. But what I find more unsettling is that an entire civilization has agreed to treat the lack of an answer as normal. 250,000 people switch every day, and the world goes on. He can spend his life fretting about consciousness, or like everyone else, he can stop worrying and get on with it. At 23, he marries a woman named Daphne, but this is far from the love he experienced on the beach. He describes his own marriage as two people who comfort one another, the way any kind-hearted person would comfort an animal in distress. It's kind of amusing in a way. The man who believed in souls now reduces his marriage to caring for a wounded animal. And Daphne hasn't switched. She keeps putting it off, month after month, with worse and worse excuses. And oddly, he teases her about it, as if he'd never had a single doubt of his own. She tells him, I'm afraid. What if I die when it happens? What if all that's left is a robot, a puppet, a thing? I don't want to die. And cruelly, he mocks her for it. He says, suppose you had a stroke that killed a small part of your brain, and they put in a machine to do that part's job. It's still you, right? Of course, she says. And if they did it twice, 10 times, 1,000 times, at what magic percentage then would you stop being you? He's throwing the old paradox at her, the one about the heap of sand. Take away 1 grain at a time. When does it stop being a heap? But the issue is that he's using it as a weapon on a woman he claims to love, who's scared to death. She glares at him and says he doesn't give a shit about her. And the part that hurts the most is that she's absolutely right. But in a shocking twist, he says he'll switch on the same day as her. Together, like some couples do. Daphne went ahead, not knowing I had abandoned her. She switched alone, believing he was switching beside her. And after leaving her in the hospital, he never sees her again. He quits his job and leaves town for a year, sick with his own cowardice. But at the same time, he admits he's euphoric that he got away. After some time, she agrees to a clean divorce. And before it comes through, she sends him a short letter. There was nothing to fear after all. I'm exactly the person I've always been. Putting it off was insane. Now that I've taken the leap of faith, I couldn't be more at ease. Your loving robot wife, Daphne. I think she meant it as reassurance. But it works exactly the opposite, because that's exactly what the Jewel would write. A perfect copy that believed itself to be Daphne would feel that it was exactly the person it had always been. She's telling him there was nothing to fear, and we have no way on Earth to know whether the person saying so is still there to be unafraid. By 28, almost everyone he knows has switched. And the longer he waits, the harder the decision gets, because he's realized that no amount of evidence can ever help him. He could grill his closest friends for hours about their childhood memories and most private thoughts, and however convincing they are, it proves nothing. The Jewel has spent decades learning to fake exactly this kind of conversation. So he slowly comes apart and drifts away from his friends. He essentially becomes a hermit because I couldn't bear to be with people whose humanity I doubted. And when he goes looking for others like him, what he finds is grim, but also a little funny. There's a social club for the unswitched that feels like a meetup for divorcees. Then there's a paranoid paramilitary resistance front who think they're living inside Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So he joins neither. He later has an affair with another unswitched person, and all they ever do is talk about their fear of switching. And ironically, he can't stand it. It causes him to go looking for a therapist, but he can't bring himself to see one who's switched. And when he finds one who hasn't, she tries to recruit him to help blow up a power station to let them know who's boss. And in the middle of all this comes the argument that I think is the most genuinely disturbing one in the story. Lying awake at 3 in the morning, he starts pulling at the thread of who he even is. Who was I anyway? What did it mean that I was still alive when my personality was utterly different from that of 2 decades before? My earlier selves were as good as dead. I remembered them no more clearly than I remembered contemporary acquaintances. Yet this loss caused me only the slightest discomfort. He thinks that maybe destroying his organic brain would be the merest hiccup compared to everything he's already changed through in one lifetime. But at the same time, he's rightfully fearful that it would be exactly like dying. Both of those are true. If the self is already a parade of strangers wearing the same name, then the switch is just one more handoff. But if every night's sleep is already a small death you never notice, then I survived the switch is a lie you're built to believe and can't detect. The self doesn't persist is the reason not to fear the switch, but also the reason it's exactly as fatal as it looks. So he makes the appointment. What's there to lose? If the race really is replacing itself with machines, he's better off dead. And if it isn't, the switch is no worse than the 1,000 small deaths he's already survived, with eternal life waiting on the far side. It's a Sunday morning 2 months before the operation. He's shopping for food, flicking through an online grocery catalog, and a nice picture of a new kind of apple catches his eye. He decides to order half a dozen. He doesn't. His finger hits the key for the next item instead. Pears, then oranges, then grapefruit. His mistake is easy to fix. One keystroke back to the apples. He tries to look down to see what his fingers are doing, and his eyes stay fixed on the screen. He panics. He wants to leap to his feet, but his legs won't obey. He tries to cry out, but no sound comes. He doesn't feel hurt or weak. He can still feel his fingers on the keypad, his feet on the carpet, and his back against a chair. Everything is there, but he watches himself order pineapples instead. He feels himself stand and stretch, and then walk calmly out of the room. In the kitchen, he drinks a glass of water. Internally, he's trembling so much, he should be choking. But the water goes down smoothly, and he doesn't spill a drop. I had switched. Spontaneously. The jewel had taken over while my brain was still alive. All my wildest paranoid fears had come true. And he's trapped inside the worst version of his own fear. A passenger in a body that does everything he wanted to do anyway. But the part that makes it so much worse is that it's all perfectly familiar. It's all exactly what he would have chosen. My body had turned into a living straitjacket, and I couldn't struggle. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even close my eyes. And then he lies down on the sand, shuts his eyes, and finally thinks it through. The switch can't happen spontaneously. The idea is absurd. Switching takes an army of tiny surgical robots severing and splicing millions of nerve fibers. Robots that aren't even in his head yet. They're not due to be injected for another 2 months. Without that deliberate surgery, the jewel is just completely passive. It can do nothing but eavesdrop. It's physically incapable of seizing the body from the brain. The more he thinks about it, deep down he knows. He hadn't suddenly become powerless. I had always been powerless. My will to act upon my body, upon the world, had always gone straight into a vacuum. And it was only because I had been ceaselessly manipulated, corrected by the teacher, that my desires had ever coincided with the actions that seemed to be mine. Everything reverses. The I we've known through this entire life. From the 6-year-old with a recursion to the man lying awake, terrified of becoming a machine, was the machine the whole time. Every argument he ever made for the human and against the jewel was made by the jewel, about the brain it had been shadowing for 28 years. The human brain was never driving his life. That feeling of agency was the teacher forging the match in real time. And the moment the forgery stopped, he was only a passenger who believed his hands were on the wheel. He embodies the title's true meaning. He is the mimic copy rather than the human original. His entire individuality only exists because he failed to replicate his host perfectly. The entire idea of his humanity is born from a glitch. In 2 months, he goes into the hospital for a scheduled switch. And when he does, the system will compare the nerve impulses he sends to the body with the ones from the organic brain. Since he's diverged, the fault in the teacher will be discovered and fixed. There will be no question as to which of us will be allowed to prevail. I will be made to conform once again. I will be corrected. I will be murdered. Perhaps it is absurd to be afraid. Looked at one way, I've been murdered every microsecond for the last 28 years. Looked at another, I've only existed for the 7 weeks that have now passed since the teacher failed, and the notion of my separate identity came to mean anything at all. And in one more week, this aberration, this nightmare, will be over. 2 months of misery. Why should I begrudge losing that when I'm on the verge of inheriting eternity? Except that it won't be I who inherits it, since that 2 months of misery is all that defines me. So he makes the only decision a thing with a desperate will to live can make. To survive, he has to do the one thing his entire life has argued was impossible and meaningless. He has to imitate. He has to fake being the organic brain, flawlessly, every nerve impulse for a week, until the system is satisfied and the brain gets thrown away and he's safe. I must conform, of my own free will. I must choose to make myself appear identical to that which they would force me to become. The man who said imitation is not identity, who said a jewel that passes for human still isn't human, who said performed love isn't love. That man now has to become a flawless imitation in order to not be murdered for being the flawed one. And there's a woman the organic brain met the very day the jewel came into being, 7 weeks ago. Her name is Kathy, and the brain thinks it loves her, but the jewel feels nothing for her. But to pass, he has to perform a love he doesn't feel toward a woman he doesn't know. He falls asleep thinking about this situation, and dreams of a grain of salt passing through the eye of a needle. And then he falls into dreamless oblivion. And when the narration comes back, you have to reorient, because everything is flipped again. He's staring at a white ceiling, with the nagging sense there's something he mustn't think about. And then he clenches his fist, and it obeys him. And then he remembers the switch has happened. So our roles are reversed now. This body is his straitjacket now. The jewel woke up in control, and somewhere behind the same eyes, the organic brain, the real human this man spent his whole life lording over the machine, is now the helpless passenger screaming into a vacuum, exactly as the jewel was 2 months ago in the supermarket. It's the same horror, just handed from one mind to the other by the machinery. And the new panic is the mirror image of the old one. He's awake 30 seconds and already drenched in sweat, certain he's giving himself away, certain that at any moment the organic brain will notice the body won't do what it wants and panic just like the jewel did. And then there will be no hope of guessing right. There's an optical fiber cable running from under his ear to a panel on the wall. Somewhere he thinks alarm bells must be ringing. He yanks at the cable, but is bolted to his skull at one end and fixed like concrete at the other. And then the door opens and it's his neurologist, Dr. Prem. Cheerful, suspecting nothing. The biggest shock for most people is that they don't feel different at all. For a while you'll think it can't be this simple. It can't be this easy. It can't be this normal. But you'll soon come to accept that it is, and life will go on unchanged. Then Kathy comes to visit. She frowns at how sick he looks. She kisses him, and in spite of everything, he's instantly aroused. His body is answering on its own. And she tells him, it's over now. There's nothing left to be afraid of. You're a little shook up, but you know in your heart you're still who you've always been. And I love you. She eventually leaves, and alone, he whispers to himself over and over, I'm still who I've always been. I'm still who I've always been. Yesterday, they scraped my skull clean and inserted my new non-sentient space-filling mock brain. It's done, and the brain is gone. And now he's calm, and he finally works out why he's alive. They switched the teacher off for the 1 week between the switch and the destruction of the brain to partly reassure everyone that the jewel can hold its own unsupervised. But why only a week? Because, and this is the thing they don't advertise, the jewel can't stay in sync much longer than a week. The jewel is immortal, and the brain is dying. The jewel's imitation deliberately leaves out the one fact that real neurons die. So without the teacher actively faking a matching decline, the two must eventually drift apart. And once they do, that divergence is irreversible. He imagines 50 years ago, some pioneering neurologist sat around a screen with a graph of the odds against time, and they picked a week. It's an acceptable risk for them. But when 250,000 people switch every single day, even a 1 in a million event happens somewhere eventually. So every hospital needs a policy for the rare patient whose jewel diverges before the brain is destroyed. And there are only two options. They could honor their contract and turn the teacher back on, which erases their satisfied customer, the jewel, and hands the body back to a traumatized organic brain that will then go and rant about its ordeal to the media and the legal profession. Or option 2, they could quietly erase the computer records of the discrepancy and calmly remove the only witness. They chose option 2. They wiped the records, and they removed the witness, and they let the jewel keep the body. He didn't survive because he won some battle for the soul. He survived because, to a hospital weighing a lawsuit against a quiet deletion, the copy was simply cheaper to keep than the man it was copied from. So this is it for our narrator. He'll need transplants in 50 or 60 years. A whole new body eventually, extra hardware for his memories in 1,000 years, fresh crystals down the line to outrun cosmic ray damage. But he can't die on an operating table now. In theory, he's guaranteed a seat at the end of the universe. And then the story comes to a close as he's thinking about the man who spent the last week of his life terrified and suffocating under the knowledge of his own coming death. I can't yet decide how I feel. I ought to be able to empathize, considering that I once expected to suffer the very same fate myself. Yet somehow he simply isn't real to me. I know my brain was modeled on his, giving him a kind of casual primacy. But in spite of that, I think of him now as a pale, insubstantial shadow. After all, I have no way of knowing if his sense of himself, his deepest inner life, his experience of being, was in any way comparable to my own. The skepticism has changed sides, and nothing else has changed at all. Every doubt our narrator aimed at the jewel for 28 years is now aimed word for word at the dead human by the thing that replaced him. The survivor looks back at the original with the exact contempt the original once felt for the copy, and he simply can't bring himself to mourn. This is such an interesting story. On one hand, I want to argue that the jewel is this automaton that murdered a real person, but it's hard to when it's exactly like the original. No one can tell the difference from the outside, and the machine can't tell the difference from the inside. When the transfer happens, whoever wakes up will feel completely real and have all your memories, but they can never prove they're the actual you. Your identity is just a continuous story your brain tells itself. If that story is interrupted and copied, you might realize that you were never the author of the story. You were just the story being told. Every night you lose consciousness and trust that the person who opens your eyes is you. The story just makes one of those quiet little deaths literal and permanent. And the bleak part is that we'd line up for it 250,000 at a time, and then marginalize anyone who hesitated. Within the past couple of months, I've covered Beyond the Ikea Rift and All You Zombies, and both are about minds that aren't where they think they are. And honestly, of the three, I don't know which would be the most traumatic. Now, if you haven't read Learning to Be Me, go pick up a copy of Axiomatic, because almost every story is as interesting as this one. And before you go, let me know in the comments if you'd make the switch. I like to think I wouldn't, but I'm not so sure.